We are going to finish off the halachot of Muktzeh today, and B'ezrat Hashem we'll start with the halachot of Purim. We only have 4 weeks until Purim. We have to start getting at least those halachot in before the Chag. So we're going to end off the halachot of Muktzeh. We got to the Kli shemelachto leheter, which we said is a tool, is a vessel that is used, that is permissible to use. So we said the halacha is with this, is that any item that is considered a kli shemelachto leheter, which we'll go into a little bit more depth into today, as to what exactly is a kli shemelachto leheter. There are items that we are allowed to use on Shabbat. There's nothing inherently forbidden with these items. So, for example, chairs, tables, utensils, books, all of these things, we're able to move them for any purpose that we may need. And we're even able to move them for their own protection, for protection from the sun. All of this would be permitted. The only caveat is that one is not allowed to handle them for no reason, for no purpose. Again, we mentioned that one of the reasons why Muktzeh was established is so that people would not carry aimlessly and accidentally carry from one domain to another domain. And because of that, the sages decided that they implemented the rules of Muktzeh. And if that's the case, then they were wary that people would carry aimlessly, even if it's a permitted item, such as a book, a table, chairs, utensils, and would accidentally carry from one rashut, one domain, to the other. And for that reason, they put a safeguard even on these permissible items, even on these items that would seemingly have been no problem. Nonetheless, we're saying that they are permitted with the guidance that you're not going to aimlessly carry them. So if someone decides that he wants to make friends with his spoon and he wants to carry it everywhere, well, that can be considered muktzeh and not allowed on Shabbat. But when he's eating, he's allowed to use that spoon. So if one person sent another person to go get an item, I told my son, go bring my I need a knife. Go bring me a knife. Instead of a knife, he brings me a hammer. I don't know, he was hard of hearing, or he thought it was going to be a good joke, and he brought me a hammer. Now that hammer we know is muktzeh, and generally we said that if it's in your hand, then you should at least allow to move it to a place where that it's going to for whatever reason be placed in a place that you're not worried about it being damaged. So if that's the case, then over here, when he accidentally brought me the hammer, he technically should place it down on the nearest place where it's not going to be damaged or interrupt anything, and go ahead and go bring that other item that I needed. And so since he brought an item that was not needed, if it's going to cause damage, whether to the item itself or to another person, he can go ahead and place it wherever he found it, or in another place that would not have been that would not create damage. But if it's for whatever reason it wouldn't have been an issue, he has to leave it there and go and bring whatever I need at that moment. So tables and chairs, standards, all of these things, there's no prohibition to them. They're kli shemelachto leheter, but of course you shouldn't go ahead aimlessly carrying a table or a chair for no purpose. The exception to this is any Torah book, Torah, Sfarim, Halachot book, books, even in English, even books in English, but about the Torah, about Halacha, about Judaism. All of these are able to be handled, even for no purpose. If someone, wants to start lifting weights with some of these books, then of course that's not it's not proper honor. It's not the proper kavod that is supposed to be used to these books. but nonetheless, he has not done anything wrong Shabbat-wise, Muktzeh-wise, because a Torah item, a books of Torah, a literature of Torah, has no Muktzeh on it at all. And that means even if he's carrying for no purpose, he has not done any prohibition. The only exception to this, and it's not so applicable to us, but it's more applicable to people in Jerusalem, people that live in walled cities from the times of Yehoshua ben Nun, is that sometimes Purim will fall on the 15th of Adar, which is Purim for those places that were surrounded by a wall during the times of Yehoshua ben Nun or Jerusalem or Shushan. I don't think anyone really lives in Shushan nowadays, especially with what's happening in Iran. But if there are, on those years, Shabbat, the 15th can fall on Shabbat. And if the 15th falls on Shabbat, there is a rabbinic prohibition from carrying a Megillat Esther, a Megillah, a scroll of Esther that was written for the sake of the mitzvah, at all. And so it becomes Muktzeh. So one's not allowed to touch it only on that Shabbat, because no one wanted a person to accidentally walk with it through the streets, through a domain. And on that Shabbat alone, we're wary of that. But in every other Shabbat, and in places that don't celebrate Purim on the 15th of Adar, then there's never an issue never a time to be worried about it. And therefore, a scroll of Esther is in those places never Muktzeh, or the rest of the year is never Muktzeh. And therefore, if someone wanted to read it on Shabbat, there's no issue. Only if Purim happened to fall on a Shabbat would there be an issue. Again, not so applicable to us here in the States. Any place really outside of Israel and any place that's outside of these walled cities would not have any issue with that. But it's just an interesting halacha, especially with Purim coming up, that we can take a look at that. Okay, foods and beverages. So as we've mentioned, that as long as they're edible by Jewish people, then they're not muktzeh, and that includes even foods that are otherwise sealed. So closed water bottles or sealed plastic bags with potato chips in them. As long as one is allowed to eat those foods, and of course we know that you're allowed to open the water bottle, you're allowed to open the plastic bag, different halachot, whether for Ashkenazim or for Sephardim. We'll Bezrat Hashem get into that later on. But nonetheless, it's permissible to eat from that food, and therefore all of those items are permissible to move. Now, we've mentioned frozen food or raw food that would be inedible is muktzeh at that point. So we talked about last week raw fish that is not edible. So there's some types of raw fish that are edible, and then it wouldn't be muktzeh. But raw fish that is not edible, raw or any other raw potatoes, raw chickpeas, all of these items are considered muktzeh, and one is not allowed to move them for whatever reason, unless it's again tzarech mekomo, tzarech kufo, and we talked about that. Especially since some of these items are considered muktzeh mechamat kufo, which even for tzorech kufo and tzorech mekomo, you're not allowed to move. Non-kosher food. So if a person for some reason has non-kosher food in his house, and it's not intended to be given to a non-Jew, and it's not intended to be given to any animals or to dogs or whatever it may be, he accidentally bought food thinking it's kosher. Suddenly someone says, hey, there's no kosher symbol, there's no OU on this. At that point, if it's not kosher, it becomes muktzeh mechamat gufo, and it may not even be handled letzorech gufo, letzorech mekomo. It cannot be handled for its own sake, for permissible use, nor for the place that it's sitting right now. With, of course, we're talking about, again, to move it with your hands. If you wanted to move it with your body, that's something else, or moving it with your leg, whatever it may be. Those are permitted items, but nonetheless, if someone finds that they have non-kosher food in their house, and they don't intend to do anything with it, it wasn't purposefully bought, Meaning, again, he accidentally, and this happens multiple times, you buy a brand, suddenly you realize that brand is no longer kosher. What happens if it's no longer kosher? Well, now we know that it's muktzeh on Shabbat, meaning don't touch it, place it on the side for whatever necessity you might need it for it after Shabbat. This is excluding, though, any, of course, dog food, where if, of course, food was being given to dogs, which are bought generally with that mindset that they're not consumable by humans, and therefore they're being given to them. Then it doesn't have to be kosher in that sense, and therefore you can give it to them. Again, you'd have to, with dog food, there's the issue of milk and meat. You want to make sure that it's not they don't have milk and meat cooked with them. I don't really know the kosher guidelines on which dog food or which cat food are allowed, but there are some restrictions on that. Nonetheless, if you had dog food, that's not muktzeh, because that's the intended purpose is for the dogs. But if you had food intended for human consumption and you found that it was not kosher, that is muktzeh, and you would not be allowed to move it. Similarly, in Israel, where they sometimes have fruits and vegetables that need to be tithed before eating, those items that are those fruits and vegetables that were not tithed beforehand, you're not allowed to tithe them on Shabbat. That's considered fixing the item. You're not allowed to fix on Shabbat. And therefore, these items would also not be allowed to be moved on Shabbat. They're muktzeh, and one is not allowed to move them. Now, if someone had, for some reason, realized before Shabbat that this item wasn't kosher, and he said, you know what, I'm going to give it to my non-Jewish neighbor, at that point, he's already designated it. He's already understood that it's not kosher, and therefore it is not muktzeh, and he's allowed to go ahead and give it to his non-kosher neighbor, even on Shabbat. The idea being here is that it happened, that this recognition of it happened on Shabbat, or it could have happened during the week, but he never designated it to be given to a non-kosher person. Maybe he really was saying, I really want those Doritos. They gave it to me. It must be a sign from Hashem that I should have it. So he's thinking the whole week, you know what? The best time to have these non-kosher Doritos is Shabbat. He comes into Shabbat and then he starts doing, he repents, he does tshuva, he says, how can I eat Doritos on Shabbat? So at that point, even though he didn't designate them, he didn't say that they're for a certain Jew, he thought that he himself was going to eat them, and then he repented. At that point, those chips are muktzeh, and he would not be able to move them. Okay? So it's
Can I ask a quick question
yes.
about this? And I'm worried it sounds silly, but that's not my intent. So you had mentioned last week, like if you have a pot that you need to move, and you can put a piece of bread in it and carry it.
Yes.
Could you do that with something that's muktzeh, no matter what it is? Like
Great.
Put some bread on the hammer?
Great question. So the question was with regards to, we talked about a leniency in moving a kli shemelachto leisur by placing a permissible object on it, for example, a piece of bread. And I think we specifically talked about a pot that is usually exclusively used for cooking. And so that's a kli shemelachto leisur, and will be muktzeh to move it for security purposes, so it doesn't get stolen or whatever. And we said that one is allowed to place a piece of bread inside of it and then move it. Now, does that apply to, for example, this case of the non-kosher food, or for different items of muktzeh? The answer to that is that it's only permissible to use that leniency with kli shel melachto leisur, only with those prohibited utensils that their main their main use is for items that are not allowed to be done on Shabbat. So what we talked about last week, the pots, the hammer, all of those things that their main use is for something that's not allowed to be done on Shabbat. And so placing a piece of bread or something permissible on it makes it allowed to be moved. We even talked about a phone, a cell phone, that would also be under the category of kli shemelachto le'isur. And if someone has an alarm on his phone, he's allowed to place a candy or some bread on it and then move it into a cupboard, into a drawer, so it stops making so much noise. But he is not allowed to do that for example, a laptop, which a laptop we said it would be considered a muktzeh mechamat chisaron kis, or for these Doritos, right? Because we said this Doritos and this non-kosher item is muktzeh mechamat gufo. So those two items are more strict. They have a greater stringency attached to them, and so therefore that leniency of placing the bread on them would not apply to those types of muktzeh. Specifically, it would mainly apply to kli shemelachto le'isur.
Thank you,
Okay, there's so when we're saying kosher, not kosher, the idea is that it's not kosher to the general body of Jewish people. And so nowadays there's a lot of debate whether Chalav Yisrael, whether non-Jewish milk powder is kosher or not kosher. And so if someone is generally doesn't eat the non-Jewish milk, so it would seem that for him it would be not kosher, right? There's actually, we'll see halachot on mishloach manot, if you're allowed to give such items to someone who does not eat, if they're stringent to only eat the Chalav Yisrael, meaning Jewish milk, in the sense that it was procured and the whole process was watched, had hashkacha, had supervision from a Jew. Nonetheless, on Shabbat, there is room to be lenient, and if someone finds and they're strict on Chalav Yisrael and they find a Kit Kat in their drawer, well, they're allowed to move it. They were lenient. If someone wants to refrain from touching them, he can be machmir. There's no problem with that. But there's no need to. He can be lenient and he can handle them on Shabbat. We talked about items that are nolad, items that were created on Shabbat are considered nolad, and they're muktzeh mechamat gufo. So, for example, an egg that was laid on Shabbat or a fruit that fell from a tree, these items are considered muktzeh, or milk that had to be milked from an animal for some reason because it was hurting them or whatever it may be. All of these items are muktzeh mechamat gufo, and they would be forbidden to move on Shabbat. Nonetheless, there is a leniency that if for whatever reason a child needs to eat and they're not accepting anything and they want that fruit that fell from the tree, at that point a mother is allowed to pick it up and give it to the child if they need to eat it. This is specifically with children, but not necessarily. It's not the same. It's not the same halacha for moderately ill people. Namely, because children are a little bit more fussy, they're a little more stubborn, and so if the child only wants to eat that fruit that fell and he's not going to eat anything and it might be detrimental to them, then we're allowed to give it to them, and the mother is allowed to even feed it to them. Anything frozen loaves of bread, frozen milk, that if it defrosts, then it's going to be edible. So they're not muktzeh. There's no problem with them. You can go ahead and eat them, and once they're defrosted, and you can move them while they're still frozen. So if for whatever reason someone needed a extra, usually what happens is someone needs an extra loaf to do lechem mishnah, to have the two loaves on, usually in Sudah Shlishit. So he takes out a frozen one with his non-frozen one, with this baked one, and with the warm one. And he does the lechem mishnah, so you're allowed to move it. There's no muktzeh on it, because if you were to leave it outside and it would thaw, you would be able to eat it. So at that point, there's no problem with that. If cucumbers were sealed in a jar in order to pickle them, the jar may nonetheless be handled on Shabbat, because even though someone's not really necessarily going to be eating them in their non-pickled state, nonetheless, since they're edible, even at that stage, then it's a edible item and it's not considered muktzeh. It's not muktzeh in the sense that it's a kli shemelachto leheter, in that it's sorry, cucumbers are not. Sorry, I take that back. They're not muktzeh because they're food. Garments and towels. They're not necessarily inherently muktzeh. They're kli shemelachto leheter. And so, if one has any intentions for using them, for wearing them, he may use them. He may put them into a laundry hamper, and all of these necessities are allowed to be done with garments and towels. If for whatever reason a talit would be torn or would be found to be not usable anymore. Then we say for sort of people that are relatively wealthy, meaning nowadays most people are considered wealthy, especially compared to previous generations. So at that point, we say that they are muktzeh because a person really does not have use for them. This is also true if, for example, the garment was fine, was intact, but one of the tzitzit were found to be broken, because at that point, a person is not allowed to wear it. It's a four-cornered garment without tzitzit, which is not allowed, and therefore they are muktzeh. A vinyl hat cover. So sometimes you'll see that the religious, especially when it's raining, they have covers for their hats. That is permissible. This is not considered a muktzeh item in the sense that you would be restricted from moving them. Similarly, rubber overshoes that protect the shoes from the rain. That's also considered not a muktzeh item in that sense. Tissues, toilet paper, wet wipes, all of these items are not considered muktzeh, and they are allowed to be used without even any general purpose. Usually there is a purpose for them, but to move them, tzarech mokomot, tzarech kufo, all of these things are not applicable. They're allowed to be moved. A blank piece of paper. So a blank piece of paper in our days is considered a kli shemelachto leheter. There's no issue with moving it. Of course, you're going to move it for no reason. Again, that's not necessarily allowed. But just to move it to get it off the table or to protect it is allowed. This is specifically nowadays. In previous generations, when it was a higher commodity, the value of paper was higher. Back then, it would be considered a muktzeh mechamat chisaron kis. But nowadays, since paper is so prevalent and there's no worth necessarily to the paper, so there's no issue with moving it on Shabbat. Disposable cups, disposable plates, plastic plates, all of these items are permissible. They're kli melachto leheter. Again, you shouldn't handle them for no apparent reason, but there is no necessarily prohibition attached to moving them. Flowers in a vase, or some of these fake flowers are in the category of kli shemelachto leheter. Sometimes you have like table decorations. All of these things are considered a kli shemelachto leheter. But if it is a potted plant, a plant that it has kind of dirt and someone's growing them, this would be forbidden to move. Whether it's to they sometimes have these potted plants that can that have like no opening in the bottom, so they get air, and so you sometimes hang them, sometimes you put them on the floor. So sometimes whether it's an earthenware vessel or a metal vessel, in all these situations, it would be prohibited to move them. But there's no issue with walking past them, or in general walking past any kind of planted object, planted herbs, planted shrubbery, planted trees, and to walk past them. This would just be a titul min asad, meaning even if you moved, if you're walking against bushes, right? It's fine, because it's titul min asad. You're not doing it with your hands. and your body is just doing them, moving them. Smelling fragrant herbs. So even though the flowers may be in water or maybe planted, we said we're not allowed to move them, and we're not allowed to take them away from the ground. Of course, that would be uprooting, that would be plowing. But one is allowed to go ahead and smell them. So if there's a nana or some kind of herb, hadassim, myrtle, whatever it may be, still in the roots, still in the ground, and he wants to go and smell them and make a blessing, he can go ahead and make the blessing, make the blessing and smell them. Should just take care not to pull them out. Last week we talked about cigarettes. We said cigarettes are considered a kli shemelachto le'isur, and they're muktzeh. Nonetheless, if you had a candy cigarette, I guess sometimes they made those cigarettes into like candies, bubble gum or whatever it may be, those are not considered muktzeh. They're fine. They're considered food. They're edible, and we don't suspect that people might think that it's an actual cigarette and that he's carrying an actual cigarette. Large ashtrays that are used for disposal of other refuse besides cigarette ashes are of the status of kli shemelachto leheter and may be handled on Shabbat for whatever use, of course, if it's not for using it aimlessly. But if it's an ashtray that is mainly and solely used for cigarette ashes or cigars or for such purposes, then it is in the status, in the category of kli shemelachto le'isur, and it would be forbidden to move it unless you need it tzorach mekomo letzorach gufo. Now that's true unless it becomes a nuisance, as we mentioned before, that there's a concept called garaf shel re'i, where it becomes disgusting to him, and he needs to remove it. At that point, all the poskim agree that he's allowed to move the ashtray in order to empty it out. Telescopes and binoculars, these are not muktzeh items. Of course, a telescope that isn't electronic or that doesn't need to be plugged in, if there's some kind of eclipse or some kind of asteroid, you can go ahead, take it out, and use it on Shabbat. And that aspect, of course, that there's no electricity attached to it, it's permissible, it's not muktzeh. We mentioned cameras. Cameras are considered muktzeh, depending on what kind of camera and according to the individual. It could be in the category of kli muktzeh mechamat chisaron kis. If it's a very valuable camera, it could be in the category of kli muktzeh mechamat chisaron kis, and therefore have all of the restrictions attached to it. A handheld fan, one of those, not the electronic ones, one of the non-electronic ones, those are not muktzeh, and one can handle them on Shabbat. Carpets, brooms, all of these items are not muktzeh. There are some who say that if it's a very large rug and it's attached to the ground, that it's muktzeh. Nonetheless, we say that it's not subject to the restrictions of muktzeh, and if someone needs to move it, there's no issues. Again, carpets, rugs, brooms, all of these are considered kli shemelachto leheter. The thermos bottles are considered kli shemelachto leheter, and even if one does not need the thermos on Shabbat, nonetheless it can be used on Shabbat, and so there's no inherent issue with that. New kitchen utensils that have been purchased from a non-Jew and that generally have to be immersed in the mikveh. So the Sephardic follow the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch that it's permissible to immerse new utensils on Shabbat. There's no issue of quote-unquote fixing it, and if that's the case, then it is not muktzeh. And one can also present it, give it as a present to a non-Jew, and then return it and get it back and borrow it back. That would also be permitted on Shabbat for Sephardic Jews. Nonetheless, Ashkenazim don't allow that. They don't hold that you're allowed to immerse vessels, new vessels, or gift it to the non-Jews on Shabbat. Nonetheless, according to Ashkenazim, these items would also not be considered muktzeh on Shabbat. So you wouldn't be able to tovel them, but they would also not be considered muktzeh, and there's no issue over there. A battery-operated watch is also considered a kli shemelachto leheter, even if it has a battery in it, and even let's say it has an illumination aspect that can you press a button and it makes a light. We are not considering this a basis ledavar ha'isur, which we'll see in the next section, and it's permissible to use to wear on Shabbat. Of course, one isn't going to come to light it, and if it's given to the kids, make sure the kids know not to make that light on Shabbat. And the idea is that it's not an issue with wearing it on Shabbat. But if a watch stopped, whether it was a mechanical watch or whether it is an electronic watch, meaning it has a battery in it, or whether one of those watches that are just mechanical, if it stopped working on Shabbat, it is considered muktzeh, and one would not be able to move it. That is basically covers the body of the halachot for kli shemelachto leheter. Before we move on, are there any questions? Okay. If not, we will continue on. Next aspect for muktzeh is basis ledavar ha'isur. Yes.
I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So, with the books, like if you've got a stack of books, I know you said that like anything related to Torah is permitted, but if you need to move like a non-Torah book to get to a Torah book, is that permitted?
Yeah. So books inherently are under that category of kli shemelachto leheter. Torah books are even more lenient in the respect that there is no issue with moving them aimlessly. So regular books, of course, you're allowed to. They're also considered kli shemelachto leheter, and there's no issue with moving them on Shabbat. Okay. Mm-hmm. So next aspect is basis ledavar ha'isur. So what's this idea? And we mentioned it before. So if anyone placed an item that is muktzeh mechamat gufo, muktzeh mechamat chisaron kis, or muktzeh kli shemelachto leheter, and he placed it on an item that is not muktzeh, and he left it there from before Shabbat into Shabbat, then the bottom, the base, whatever it's placed, whatever is on the bottom, is considered a basis ledavar ha'isur, and it takes the same level of muktzeh as the item on top of it. And the idea being is that the just as the top item is muktzeh, now so too the bottom item, which wouldn't have been inherently muktzeh, gains that status of muktzeh of that which is on top of it. Usually the classic case is that some woman light their Friday night candles on a tray. Alright? So now, even though the tray itself would have been a kli shemelachto leheter and it would have been able to be moved, but since the lighting of the candles made the candlesticks and let's say the wax or the oil, they're muktzeh, alright? Muktzeh mechamat, we said it could even be gufo. Therefore, that changes the attribute of the tray that's underneath it to a basis ledavar ha'isur, and it has the same stringencies as muktzeh mechamat gufo, and it would not be able to be moved even letzorech gufo, letzorech mekomo. The question is, so before we get to that, so this is true when the object that is placed on it was done by the owner and with his understanding that he did it. What does it mean? That means that if I had my wallet with all my money on it, and I put it on on my neighbor's pillow, right? I was giving them a nice present, but it was on Shabbat, right? I placed it there before Shabbat, and it remained there until into Shabbat. So because I did it, and I put it on his item, so that doesn't make his pillow now a basis ladavar isur, because I put it there, and his item shouldn't get forbidden because of my action. Similarly, if for whatever reason my money fell out of my own pocket accidentally onto my pillowcase, even though they are my items, nonetheless, because they were not done with my knowledge, they weren't done with my understanding, they happened to be placed there by my actions, but not with intent, it does not turn that pillow into a basis ladavar ha'isur. It comes out that the owner of the bottom item has to have been the one to place that muktzeh item on it with the understanding, with the intent, with the consent that he was doing it. At that point, that bottom piece, that bottom utensil, that bottom object becomes the same level of muktzeh as the top. So, one of the aspects to this is if someone had placed money on a pillow, intending for that money to remain there for on Shabbat for whatever reason. So, if that's the case, then that's a classic case of a basis ladavar isur, and therefore that pillow becomes the same level of isur, the same level of muktzeh as the money, even if and therefore it is forbidden to shake the pillow to make the money fall off on Shabbat. And so even if a non-Jew comes and removes the money from the pillow, or for some reason the money fell off the pillow, nonetheless the pillow itself remains in that status of muktzeh until Shabbat ends. The next Shabbat it goes back to being a regular kli shel melachto leheter, no problem there. But that one Shabbat that it became a kli basis ladavar isur, that had that muktzeh item on top of it into Shabbat, and for a duration of the Shabbat, at that point it becomes a basis ladavar isur. Even if that item is taken off of it, it is nonetheless forbidden to use it, to move it for any purpose. If someone was worried that someone's going to steal the money from him, then he's allowed to do what's called titul min hatzad. He can indirectly, I guess, kick the money off or move it with his body. That's not an issue. And so if of course he tilts the pillow with his feet or whatever, and it happens to fall off, that's allowed, at least in order so that no one will steal the money. So we're saying if two items were placed on the pillow now, instead of just having one item, with just having the money, there was the money. But then there was also a piece of bread. Now that the piece of bread was on there, it no longer is just a kli. It only does not become a basis ladavar ha'isur. It now has a permitted item and a prohibited item on it, and so becomes a basis ladavar ha'isur ve'hamutar, a base for both a permitted and forbidden item. And at that point, it does not become forbidden to lift. So where you would see this come in play is drawers, right? Generally, drawers can sometimes have in them money, a baking powder, things that you would not, flour, whatever it may be, things that you don't need on Shabbat. It could have a telephone, whatever may be in it. And so, but it could also have within it items that are permissible, maybe forks and knives, plates, whatever it may be. Now, if the drawer is strictly muktzeh items, then you're not allowed to even open that drawer on Shabbat. That drawer is a basis ledavar ha'isur that has the muktzeh items in it, and the drawer and it was placed in there by the owner with intent, with the understanding from before Shabbat into Shabbat, then we say that drawer is muktzeh, and one is not allowed to open or close it on Shabbat. Of course, we're talking about with the hands. If he bumps into it and closes it so that people don't walk into it, that would be allowed. But to go ahead and close it like you would normally open or close it, that is forbidden. And even if you would say that it is a kli it's a basis ledavar ha'isur v'mutar, we generally look at what is the most valuable item in there, and that would give the status of the drawer. So if I have a drawer full of forks and knives, and there happens to be some matches in there, so that's a normal case of a basis ledavar ha'isur v'mutar, because the forks and knives are outweighing the matches to make that drawer now forbidden to use. But if I had a drawer with forks and knives and then I had my laptop in there, well, my laptop outvalues the forks and knives, and so it changes that drawer. Even though they have both a permitted item and a prohibited item, the value of the prohibited item outweighs the permitted item, and therefore it turns it into a basis ledavar ha'isur. So if in those cases where you have a basis ledavar ha'isur va'mutar, then if I were to take the good item, the permitted item, away, what I have done is I have changed it from a basis ledavar mutar va'isur, a base for both a permitted and a forbidden item. When I take away that permitted item, now it just becomes a basis ledavar ha'isur. It becomes a base for a prohibited item. This is called mevatel kli mechamato. This is considered in the terms of the Gemara that you have nullified the name of the kli, of the vessel, because of your action. Meaning that once I remove, let's say I had that drawer with forks and knives and I had matches in there and I took out all the forks and knives, so now no longer is that drawer a basis, a base for both permitted and forbidden items. It only is holding prohibited items, matches, and therefore it turns the drawer into a muktzeh item. The drawer now only holds muktzeh items, so the drawer itself is a muktzeh item, and I've nullified, I've taken it out of the hagdara, the status of a permissible item, and I've turned it into a prohibited item. This is not allowed on Shabbat. This is prohibited to do on Shabbat. This is why when we mentioned earlier that if someone's eating nuts or peeling eggs on Shabbat, he cannot do it into a empty bowl, empty plate. He would need to make sure that there are some other items, edible items, or on the shelves themselves, there's some flesh of the nuts or of the eggs themselves, in order to make it not considered strictly muktzeh items that are being placed on a permissible item. Because if that is done, that's considered mevatel kli mechamato. You are nullifying the kli, you're destroying the permissibility of that plate, of that bowl, and you've effectively turned it into a muktzeh item, which is prohibited to do on Shabbat. So we said the advice is to either put a edible food in there, whether it be bread, whether it be some fruit, whatever it may be. At that point, then you can fill it up with all of your nuts, with all of your shells, with all of your eggshells or your nut shells, and there's no issue with moving them afterwards, because then it's becoming a kli melachto leheter ve'isur. No issue there. Another place where this is kind of prevalent is, well, we didn't talk about this, but there's a machloket on tefillin. If tefillin is under the category of a kli shemelachto le'isur, and then therefore it being muktzeh, and some poskim rule that it is, whereas some hold that it's not. Now, according to those opinions that say tefillin are a kli shemelachto le'isur, that they're muktzeh, sometimes the men, they have a talit bag that holds both the tefillin and the talit. Now on Shabbat, so this talit bag, this bag is a basis ledavar isur ve'amutar. It is a base for both a prohibited item, namely the tefillin, and a permitted item, namely the talit. Now, someone on Shabbat wants to go ahead and put on his talit. What happens? He takes out the permitted item and he turns the talit bag into a basis ledavar isur. And he's mevatel shem kli on it. He's mevatel kli mechamatom, which we said is prohibited to do on Shabbat. He's nullifying the kli. He's making it into a muktzeh item. So what's the eitzah? What's the advice? Similarly, like what we said for the eggshells or the nutshells, what should he do? He should place some kind of item, permissible item. Of course, you shouldn't be placing food into necessarily the talit bag unless you bring candy to the children. Then, of course, if you have candy in there, that would make it into a basis ledavar isur ve'amutar. Or you can put a sefer, a siddur, a tehillim, whatever it may be, place it into the bag. Therefore, it's no longer designated as a basis ledavar ha'isur. You wouldn't, when you take out the talit, now it's a basis ledavar ha'isur ve'amutar, and you can go ahead and move it and take out the talit. And you want to make sure that you do this before you take out the talit. Electric blankets. Electric blankets are actually permissible to use on Shabbat if you, for whatever reason, had left it on Shabbat, and it's not going to be taken out of the cord, or I guess maybe if it's battery powered, that you're not going to be able to turn it off for whatever reason. At that point, you are allowed to use it. Of course, you're not allowed to change any of the settings, and it's not considered a basis ledavar ha'isur. Let me just finish off. We mentioned that mitzvah items are also muktzeh, so anything that is a mitzvah item, lulav, shofar, when it's specifically used that day for a mitzvah, any decorations of the sukkah, any of those items would be considered muktzeh and not allowed to be moved. Just two more halachot, and then I'll open it up for questions. Something that is a wet piece of clothing that was placed into the dryer before Shabbat, even though and of course the dryer it's not going to turn any lights or any noise. If you were to open it, this is permissible to remove them on Shabbat. This is not considered muktzeh, even though you placed it in there and kind of took it out of your mind. Nonetheless, those are allowed. You're allowed to take them out of the laundry if you need it. Last kind of more important understanding is that is if a child is holding a muktzeh item. So if a child is holding a muktzeh item, depending on that child's age, he can become a basis ledavar isur. He becomes a base for something that's prohibited. So if a child picks up a stone from the floor, the stone is muktzeh machamad kufo, and if he picks it up, then the child becomes that base for a prohibited item. What's the repercussion of this? The repercussion of this is that you're not allowed to pick up the child if he's holding that rock. Now, if the child starts to cry and he's emotionally attached to the parents and he's going to make himself sick, and he's not going to let go of that rock either, because the kids never let go of the rock once they hold on to that rock. At that point, you're allowed to. And you're also allowed to hold their hand even if they're not going to cry. It's permissible to hold the hand, even though you're not going to pick them up. Even though the child is holding something, even if it's muktzeh like money, the child found like $100 bill, and you told the child, hey, listen, go pick that up, so bring it back home, and then you start walking them with their hand. You're allowed to hold their hand. Their hand isn't considered holding them, but if you were to actually carry them, that would be not allowed. So if the child is holding money or the child is holding a stone, you would not be able to pick them up to move them. I guess the last piece, since we did have a couple of weeks ago snow and hail. Snow and hail is not considered muktzeh, even though we would consider quote unquote nolad. Some people would say that it's nolad. The vast majority of poskim say it's not nolad. There's no issue with that, and therefore, if it were to snow, you're allowed to move the snow. It's permissible to make snowballs, I guess, and throw it at people, and no issue on that. Okay, I will open up the questions now.